Hey, so last week, if you were here last week, I did something to you on accident that I didn't mean to do. Last week, I heard from so many people after the services and then during the week, I heard so many people say, why didn't you finish the story and tell us what happened? Like everybody. And so I found myself realizing like, it was an unintentional cliffhanger. I did not mean to leave you guys hanging. Those of you that weren't here last week, I'll just fill you in real quickly because this is what happened. This week as I thought about it, I was like, the rest of the story, and I promise you I didn't do this, I'm not smart enough to do this on purpose, but the rest of the story actually works into what we're talking about today. And so I was like, this is actually really great. But again, not intentional. Those of you that weren't here last week, I was telling a story about being caught on a very slow boat with a very small motor on Lake Coeur d'Alene 2 weeks ago during a very big storm and trying to outrun the storm. And so I just thought, I want to finish this week and you'll see kind of where it goes. But so last week, I kind of told you about this. Those of you that weren't here, like there's panic and a little bit of fear and a lot of dark, ominous clouds and a big storm and all that sort of stuff. You can go back and listen to the beginning part of this story. So we found ourselves kind of racing to this cove over on Lake Coeur d'Alene, Beauty Bay. We said, we've got to get there. That's going to be like the safest place for us in this storm. And so we're cruising along, at our 4 miles an hour. And I'm hoping that when we round the corner, there's some mooring buoys in that cove. And my hope is that one of those mooring buoys is going to be open and we can lash ourselves to it and just weather the storm in that spot. So, and by the way, everyone was like, what happened to the story? I just got to say, I'm here. So we lived. So that part of it, there's nothing dramatic. We lived, we're all okay. But we round the corner and I see the mooring buoys. There's only one boat and 2 of them are open. And so I'm like, all right, we got this. Now it's still a long ways and really a long ways in my very slow boat that I'm in. And so we're cruising along and I'm just like, come on, baby. And I'm watching the clouds come over the hills. It's really about to hit. And as we're going, I notice that I look behind me, I notice there's another boat that comes around the corner and everybody's trying to scramble off the lake. This guy's moving as fast as I want to, right? He is just blazing across the lake. So he comes around the corner, comes bombing, coming up close to us. And I have this typical guy thought. I got kind of competitive and I knew I wasn't going to beat him. Not that kind of competitive. There was no way that was happening. I just thought to myself, this joker's going to take our buoy. So I said that out loud to Sherry. I said, I think this guy's going to take our buoy. And we're in the middle of this panic. And she looks at me and she goes, why are you that way? Why do you assume the worst? And I go, he's gonna, you just watch. And she's like, you're ridiculous, right? And so here we are, cruising along. This guy comes hauling past us, moves right past us, cuts right in front of me. And this sailboat doesn't turn easy. Once it gets going, it doesn't stop easily. It's just a big, heavy, slow boat. And I'm moving towards this buoy. This joker comes around me and cuts right in front of me with 20 yards to go, drops his motor, glides in, grabs the buoy and starts tying it up. And inside of me, this thing welled up, right? Suddenly the impending storm was nothing compared to the fury inside of my soul. So I just throw my arms up. I go, are you kidding me? Like that. And there was one problem. Because he turned his motor off, he heard me. So I'm like, it's all good. No. Just, are you talking to the kids? That? No. So his wife turns and she goes, oh, which buoy do you want? Because there's another one deeper in the... And I was this close to saying, oh, I don't know, the one we were aiming for? The one we've been driving towards for an hour? That one, the one that you cut me off to get to? Maybe that one. But I go, nope, it's all good, and just kind of moved on in my mind. I'm suppress it, don't yell, don't say anything. So we start going by, and the guy yells up at us. He goes, well, we've been here for 3 straight nights. And Sherry says, good for you. And I was like, baby, no, calm it down. We're going to be in a cove in a storm with these people. We might need them at some point. This is Survivor at this point. We got to be smart about this, right? And so we go over, and then as we're going by, he tries being friendly. And I'm like, I am not having any of it. He's like, yeah, there's been a moose that's been coming down here every night. And I'm like, there's a storm and you took my buoy. I don't care. So the end of the story is this. We pull the boat up to the other buoy. We finally get there. I'm tying the boat up. I'm doing all this stuff. The wind is just starting to really blow. And I'm not exaggerating. The moment that I got the boat all tied up, I jumped back down, got in the cabin, pulled the slide over, and it just started pouring rain, dumping, boiling rain, windy. It was crazy. If you're in town, you know that storm. Meg and her little friend that were with us, they looked at each other and they go, I think maybe we should pray. I was like, I authorize that right now. That's a good idea. Yeah, that's probably something you should do. So while they're praying, I'm sitting there thinking, and I'm not thinking about the storm. I was actually thinking about my response to that guy. And there was this little part of me that was like, why? Why did I yell? Like, why? What is it in me that, what made me go, are you kidding me? I mean, obviously I know what made me yell that. The same thing that would make you yell that. But then there was this other part of me that while I'm sitting down waiting for the storm to blow over, I'm just thinking like, shouldn't I be different? Shouldn't I have a different response to those moments? Like of all people, right? Wouldn't you think? Like, shouldn't we be different? And I started thinking about that, and I started realizing that that's the dynamic of what we're going to be talking about this morning, and grace changes everything. Grace changes us in a way that makes a remarkable difference in how we respond. And I found myself wondering, like, am I supposed to be different? Am I not supposed to have an alternative response to those circumstances? Am I not supposed to be something different? And I know sometimes there's that question of like, well, where does that come from? What is that? Where does that stir up? And I'm not talking about some sort of guilt thing. I'm not saying that I was sitting there laying, like thinking about all the guilt of laying in bed at night, like, oh man, I shouldn't have said that. There was just this thing that's like, man, I think we're supposed to be different. So where does that come from? Where does that actually happen? Well, there's something that I want to unpack today, and it's going to be kind of a long journey as we come to the close of this. But in the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul is talking about who we are as a community. And in our last series, we talked about who we are instead, and we kind of skipped over something in that series that I want to go back and revisit. But he's talking about something that has an impact on us being a new community, on us being an alternative community, of us being a different expression of what it looks like to be human. And these verses, I think, speak to something powerful and also something we seldom really think about in terms of our own lives. I want you to listen to this. Very interesting verses with some complexity involved in them. It says this, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 20. Paul says, talking about God, he says, he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand, speaking of Jesus, in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named. And then there's this strange sentence. Not only in this age, but also in the one to come. So Paul's making a statement about Jesus, and he says, listen, Jesus has authority. He has rule. He has dominion. His name is above every other name in this age and in the age to come. So he's identifying something that I think we seldom really think about. He's talking about two different ages. There is this present age, and then there is this age to come. Now, before we even get to unpacking those, I want us to think about this. Like he's saying Jesus rules in both of them. So the question is, how can Jesus rule over something that is present and something that is future? How can Jesus be ruling over two different things, one that's happening in this moment and one that's happening in the future? I want us to understand what Paul's referring to when he talks about this present age and then the age that is to come. The present age that he's describing is the age in which sin, brokenness, reigns. That's the present age. The present age is the age in which everything is disintegrating and broken because of sin in the world. It begins, if you open the pages of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 3, we have this story that presents where human brokenness came from. And at the fall of Adam and Eve, we see that as soon as they sinned, as soon as this story is told, it says that they experienced this fracture. They experienced this spiritual alienation from God. They became disconnected from God, not wholly in relationship with Him. They became emotionally alienated from themselves. They became disjointed as individuals. They became relationally disjointed from each other. Now there was conflict. There was even a disconnection now with their own bodies that's described in Genesis 3. Like things became broken because of the fall. That is this present age. This present age is an age in which everything is impacted by that brokenness. Everybody's workday, everybody's family, everybody's personal history, everybody's emotions, everybody's spirituality. We are impacted, we are disconnected, we are broken because of that part of the story. Spiritually, emotionally, socially, that's this present age. Here's what's fascinating. When you read the Old Testament writers over and over again are speaking to something in the future called the age to come. They spoke and wrote poems and all sorts of beautiful literature around this idea that at some point, this broken place we live in would be restored and renewed, and they would look forward to this. And so they would speak of this time when God would restore all these things, and he would heal the brokenness, and all of this stuff would now, the disintegration would turn, and redemption and transformation would be now the new theme of life. They would talk about this. In fact, in the book of Psalms, Psalm 96, the writer of the Psalm says these words, and it's just a beautiful expression of this. He says, "Let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth, to judge the world in righteousness and the people in his faithfulness." They're speaking of this future and saying, not only will brokenness be healed, but also even the earth, the very creation of the earth, will cry out in praise and acknowledgement of what's taking place. So in this age to come, all that is broken, all that's alienated will be healed. The entire world, in all of its dimensions, it will be renewed, it will be healed. Pain will be banished, tears wiped away. Even the trees, the psalmist says, will shout for joy. Now here's what's interesting. When Jesus comes, and we're introduced to him coming in the Gospels, when Jesus comes to earth, he brings with him the power of the age to come. That's what Paul is talking about in Ephesians. He brings the power of the age to come into this present age, into this world, so that we can experience it now. So there are two dynamics to Jesus coming. The first one is this, imagine that, even though, maybe today you find yourself living in some sort of poverty, right? You find yourself living in a place where you have, very little money. But somebody comes to you and says, in the future, I'm going to give you millions of dollars and you'll never have to think about money again. Regardless of your momentary poverty, the promise of somebody giving you millions of dollars would absolutely change your expectation or your emotions in the present poverty, right? If you know, I could be poor, I could have not even 2 pennies to rub together, but if I know that in a few months or in a few years, somebody's going to bless me with millions of dollars, then in that moment of poverty, I'm completely relieved, right? This is really temporary because I know there's something ahead of me. Certainly that is a part of the message of the gospel. There is this reality in our future, this age to come, that changes the way we respond to things right now. We know a future that changes our present. But there's another dynamic that Jesus unpacks for us, that Paul is showing us, that's a beautiful dynamic, something we seldom look at. When Jesus comes, he doesn't just say there's this promised inheritance, but Jesus comes to us and says, I'm giving you power from that future to now impact the present. In other words, you're going to get millions of dollars someday, but in the meantime, how's a couple $100,000 a year do to get you by? So you have an experience in the present that is reflective of a future that's ahead of you. That's what Jesus accomplishes. When Christ returns, this present age will come to an end, and it will be the beginning of this age to come. But in the meanwhile, we actually live between the two worlds in this overlapping in-between place. So the question then becomes for us, how do we live in this new reality? Not the age that was desperate and disintegrating, not the age that is to come, but this place in between where we have the power of Jesus Christ to impact and influence change in this world. How do we live? What does this mean for us? How does it shape us? What does the gospel do for us as a community and as individuals living this out today? In Matthew, Jesus had gathered the first group of people that really would become the first followers of Jesus together. And he started talking to them about the distinctives of what it looked like to live in him. And it's called the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, he says these words that sort of answer the question that I just asked. How do we live? How do we live in light of this? And this is what he said. He said, you're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. And it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. So the big idea here, Jesus says this. You want to know how to answer this? Understand this about yourselves. You are a city on a hill. You're a city on a hill. What does it mean for us to be a city on a hill? He's saying, listen, you are like the bright lights at night of a city that you can see from a distance. You are elevated and people can see you. You're a beacon. And what that means to us ultimately is breathtaking. It means that we get to be an alternate city, a different kind of city. We get to be a city where our lives shine. He's saying you are an example. You're a beacon. You are showing people in the present brokenness the future hope. You are giving them a taste of what is to come, an alternative. He's saying one day, like, God is going to unite and renew and heal all of these things. He's going to put all these things under the lordship of Jesus. But currently, you, the church, you, the people that follow Jesus, are an expression of what that looks like. You show somebody something different, an alternative sort of city. That's what it means to be a city on a hill. So the question is, what does that look like? What does that look like? If you and I are to be a city on a hill, if Jesus says you are the light of the world, if that's his, then what do we actually do? And I want to talk about three things. The first one is this. If you're taking notes, you can jot these down. The first is this, that an alternate city, an alternate people, an alternate city is speaking the gospel. We are gospel-speaking people. I think it's really easy sometimes for us, and this is kind of challenging. I'll throw this out as a challenge. It's a challenge for me at times. I know it's a challenge for you. But sometimes we hide how important Jesus really is to us. Like, we've personalized Jesus to a point where it's very private, very personal, very much about how we get through. But we don't really show our cards and let other people know how incredibly important Jesus is to us. Like, we don't talk about him. We may talk about him in here. We may find ourselves even singing songs with other people in here. We may talk about it in a community group, in a Bible study or something like that. But the truth is, we don't talk about how meaningful Jesus is. Even though he can be incredibly meaningful, if people were to measure what's important to us based on our conversation and what we speak of, they think that maybe football was important to us. They think that politics were important to us, or that the financial markets are important to us. But would people understand based on how we talk whether or not Jesus is really important to us? He may be very important to us, but oftentimes our speech doesn't match that. But in a city on a hill, a people who show something different, we find ways to present and talk about Jesus. We find ways to describe the gospel in new language. We find ways to articulate who Jesus is to the people in our neighborhoods and our coworkers, our colleagues, the people that live life around us. We find ways to do that. And I know this stirs up tension inside of us. I know, even for me, a few years ago, Nick and I, we were developing just a friendship with this guy that Nick knew from junior high. And I met him, and then we just Nick reconnected with him. We started developing this relationship with him. And we'd hang out together. And he's a guy that believed spiritually very different things from Nick and I. And so we'd have these great times kind of hanging out, talking about stuff, talking about life, different things. But over a long period of time, it was just like, man, this sense of I'm wondering when we'll ever get to talk to him about this Jesus stuff. But after a couple of years of hanging out, this one day we were eating, and at the end of this meal, Nick said, hey, I'm going to hop up and go use the restroom. So he gets up, and as Nick walks away, I'll never forget this. This friend of ours looks over at me, and he goes, hey, so what do you guys believe anyways? Which I was like, after 2 years, I'm in trouble, right? Like, if after 2 years you don't know what I believe, I'm a little bit, no, but that wasn't, I knew he wasn't just saying, like, what do you believe? Like, I knew he knows who Christians are. He knows that we're Christians. He knows we're pastors. He kind of knows what we believe. But here's the deal. He was saying, there's something about you guys. There's something different. So tell me, what is it that you really believe? And I remember watching Nick as he's walking away, and I'm thinking, I hate you right now. Like, you're abandoning me. Like, I'm like, here's this moment, and I'm like, what do I say? And I knew I had like 30 seconds. So I'm kind of scrambling. I'm just sharing this with you because I think this is where we all live. I'm kind of scrambling in my heart. I'm like, I don't know what to say. And then I just looked at him and I said, here's what we believe. We believe that Jesus came not to establish a religion, but to establish and open a new way of us relating to our Creator. And that through Jesus, we can have a life and a way of living life like no other thing ever offers. Like, he gave us something that the world was longing for. And my buddy looks at me and he goes, I'm down with that. And he fist bumps me. And I was like, yes, like... And it was over. And then Nick came back, and as we drove away, I was like, you will never believe what happened when you were in the car. Like, it was this moment, like, we've been loving this guy, wanting to tell him, like, what we really believe. And it was this crazy sort of moment. To be a city on a hill, we have to talk about Jesus. You can't be a city on a hill and not talk about Jesus. You can't just talk about the life of Jesus. You can't just talk about the stuff of Jesus. You can't just talk about the stuff of church. You have to talk about Jesus. That's where it begins. And so the question is, how do we do that? How do you do that? What will the themes be? What's the sort of story that you would tell? This is something that's a part of our life as a city on a hill. When somebody asks you about what you believe and who Jesus is, what sort of things are compelling that are going to come out of your mouth that people go, oh man, that's something that I want. That's something that's beautiful. And I know there's a lot of confusion around this. I know that there's tension. I know that people can disagree on how this gets done. It needs to happen in the church. It needs to happen on the street. You should scream at people. You should not scream at people. There's all sorts of ways that people disagree around how this sort of thing happens. But I love this. The Apostle Peter was writing to the church and he was talking about this. How do you? And I love this stuff because it's so practical, because I think this is real. This is the real stuff where we go, man, I really do think Jesus is important. Maybe I don't talk about him a lot, but how do I talk about him when the opportunity comes? And I love this because Peter was writing to the church. They're dealing with the same stuff we're dealing with. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, he says these words. He says, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And I'll just pause there for a second. I love that. Be ready to tell people why you have hope. Be ready to tell people that even though you're in the same present that they are, you're connected to a future that is beautiful and gives you a hope. Be prepared to talk about that. And then he says, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And man, I love that. I love that because for me, that's how I want to live towards people, right? Isn't that how you want to live towards people? Somebody says, how do you do this? Well, I mean, here's the big lesson in this. Here's how you do this. You do it with gentleness and respect. So if somebody asks you to give a reason to them for why you're a Christian, why you have faith in Jesus, why Jesus is important to you, if someone asked you why you believe what you believe, would you be able to answer them sympathetically? Could you get in their shoes and remember what it was like to be living where they're living? Can you do it gently? Can you do it respectfully? Can you respect who they are and what it is that they value? Can you do it lovingly? And at the same time, can you do it faithfully? And can you do it convincingly? And sometimes, we just tell people, well, I believe this. They're supposed to just believe that because we believe it, it's true. And we forget that there's a grace involved, that God compelled us. He's drawn us by his grace. And we never believed we'd believe these things before, but now we do. When we see that in other people's eyes, that changes. We're respectful. We're compassionate. And we give an answer. So that's the first part of being a city on a hill. We talk about Jesus. We tell people, this is the reason for my hope. Secondly is this. An alternate city is neighbor loving. It's neighbor loving. We love our neighbors. You look at the stories of Jesus, and over again, if you were to link who he interacts with, if you were to synthesize all of the stories of Jesus talking with people, men, women, all over the place, you see this theme. Jesus regularly embraced the people who were morally outcasts. He embraced the people who were spiritual outsiders. Jesus has this theme over and over again. He's embracing the very people that, whether it was because of something moral that they had done in their culture or because of something social that they weren't in their culture, were being ostracized by their culture, Jesus is embracing those people. So in the same passage in Matthew, when he was talking about who we are and how we live towards other people, in the Sermon on the Mount, in verse 47, he says this. After talking about being a light, he says these words. He says, and if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? He's saying, listen, if you spend your life and the only people you engage with, the only people you love, the only people you care for, the ones who look just like you, think like you, act like you, vote like you, all those sort of things, what good is that? That's what everybody does. You're an alternate city. You're a city on a hill. You're something different. Is that something that's active and alive in your life? He says something interesting. He talks about greeting. I think we think about this in very static terms, just greeting somebody around us. In fact, we greet differently on the West Coast than people greet on the East Coast. Did you know that? Like on the West Coast, we just like shake hands. Like guys in particular, we have like rhythms. We do this. Watch this. This is really funny. Like guys, when we shake hands, if we go in for the bro hug where you shake hands and you pull somebody in, like Josh, if I was to shake your hand, I pull you in, I would go, like come around. Like guys always do this. It's the 3 tap. Boom, boom, boom. And then you look at each other like, yeah, good, man. You step back, right? That's the way we greet. Guys greet on the West Coast, right? That's a guy embrace. When we moved to New York City years ago, we moved there and we found like something radically different. People kiss each other in New York. And I remember we first like got there, like not on the lips, like weird stuff, just like on the cheek. Like some of you guys are like, really? Like, I'm never going to New York. No, just like when you get to know somebody and you see people on the street, then you just like walk up and you like hug and like you kiss cheeks, the little kiss thing, And I remember like the first time someone kissed my wife, I was like, you're going to, like that thing. But I calmed it down, and eventually, like I found myself greeting the way that other people greeted. And I'll never forget this story. This one time, Sherry had 3 friends that flew out from Spokane to come visit us, and she sent me to the airport to pick them up. We've been living there like a year and a half at this point. So I go to the airport to pick them up, and I see him coming out, and I walk up to him, and I kissed him. And as I kissed the last one on the cheek, I like pulled back, and I was like, something's weird. And I think they were thinking the same thing. So later on, they got Sherry alone. They go, is Brad all right? Like he was like really like kind of like, he was like physical. Like he kissed us on the cheek and it was just, and Sherry's like, oh my gosh. Like we have started greeting the way that people greet in New York, and our West Coast friends are kind of freaked out by it. Rightly so, right? When Jesus talks about greeting, he's talking about a Jewish greeting. When he talks about this idea of embracing a brother, this is so different than what you and I think of. When a Jewish individual approached another person, another Jew, they would utter the word shalom to one another. The word shalom is this word that captures, in one single word, it captures all that is human flourishing. So you would say shalom, and you spoke it as a prayer over somebody. It was like speaking a blessing over somebody. It was like shalom. And what you were asking for was God to bring renewal and refreshing and restoration to that person's life, like every dynamic of their life. So this embracing, this greeting is this shalom. I'm just asking for God's best in you. And then the embrace was a true and genuine embrace. So they would shalom and embrace one another. So Jesus says, do you only offer the word shalom to those who are just like you? Or are you comfortable blessing those who vote differently than you and think differently than you and entertain themselves differently? Do you shalom the outsider? Do you shalom people that are not just like you? So the question for all of us is, how are we towards our neighbors? Are we seeking God's blessing? Are we embracing? Are we living towards them the way that Jesus lived? That's what he was calling us to. That's the second way that we're a sign of the age to come. We're a city on a hill because we live towards people who are different than us because of the gospel, differently than the rest of the culture. The rest of the culture is comfortable hating people that are different than them. We cannot be. And then third and finally, an alternate city is community transforming. Jesus prays for his disciples in the book of John, and we looked at that last week in John 17. We didn't read these verses. I want you to just listen with me. Jesus is praying for his disciples. He's praying about this whole idea of them being a light in the world. And listen to what he says. He says, sanctify them. He's praying to his Father in heaven. He says, sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And this is what I want you to catch here. I want you to see what Jesus is doing. He's sending his disciples out to be a light, to share who he is. But he's not praying that they would be eloquent and articulate. He's not saying like, Father, make them smarter than they currently are. Like make them more entertaining, make them more articulate, make them engaging. He doesn't say that. He actually says something very counterintuitive. He's sending them into the world to share their faith, and he's praying that they would be sanctified. He's praying that they would be holy, which last week we saw meant set apart, that they'd be different. Well, why is he praying this? Why is he saying as they go out, let them be sanctified, let them be different? Well, he's praying this because that's where credibility comes in. If you're consistent with your behavior, there's a credibility. There's a credibility that comes when people see the gospel transforming you. You say you're a Christian? You say you believe the gospel? Well, let me see it in your life. That's where it's lived out. Has the gospel made you a more kind person? Has the gospel made you a person who treats people better in your life? Are you a person who's more patient? How do you face troubles? How do you deal with loss in your life? How do you deal with frustration and brokenness in you and brokenness in others? Is the gospel really making a difference? Can I look at your life and see that it's actually impacting you? That's what Jesus prays for. I don't pray that they be smart and articulate. I pray that their lives would actually show that this is true. I pray that they would embody this. And so the question is, what is your life saying to others around you? In Acts chapter 16, there's this beautiful story of how this works itself out. There's a story of a centurion, a jailer, living in the city of Philippi who becomes a Christ follower. The story of how he becomes a Christ follower is unbelievable because it's just how so many in our culture do. In the city of Philippi, the Apostle Paul had shown up beginning of the chapter. He's proclaiming the gospel. He's preaching. He's starting Bible studies. And there are people who are converted to the message of Jesus because of Paul's words. Very cool thing. Beautiful thing. Then there's a story of a slave girl who's possessed by a demon, and Paul casts the demon out of her, and there's this uprising because she was a form of economic gain for the men who mastered her. And so there's this uprising, and so even though there's this healing, there's this dynamic, powerful moment of the gospel being proclaimed in someone's life, they get imprisoned. In this prison, this centurion jailer, this guy who's standing there with the Apostle Paul and his companions in the jail, watching over them, he has heard the message of the gospel with his ears. He has seen and actually had people talk to him about this dynamic thing that happened in this woman's life, and yet he's completely unchanged. It's like, good, you can keep talking about Jesus and all this resurrection stuff and all the church, whatever, you can do that. You can tell me about the healing and all the dynamic spiritual stuff. That's cool. He just was totally unconnected and unconcerned about it. They go to bed that night, and there's an earthquake. You read about this in Acts 16. There's an earthquake. And the bars of the prison are broken. The gates swing open. The shackles fall off of Paul and his companions. And there's this moment where the centurion, in the darkness of that moment, begins to take his own life because he knew that if his prisoners escaped, the cost to him was his own life. So he goes to take his own life. And in the middle of the darkness, he hears the voice of the Apostle Paul call out and say, "We're still here. Don't take your life." The man gets a lantern, rushes in, looks at them, and then he says this, "What must I do to be saved?" And what's fascinating about this is it wasn't the words that changed his heart, and it wasn't the power encounter with this woman that changed his heart. It was that suddenly he saw a group of people who were living so radically different when everybody else would have run, even at the cost of his life, when every other prisoner would have scattered outside of the prison. These men stayed to save his life. They embodied the gospel. And because of that, he said, "What do I need to do to be like you?" That's what Jesus is talking about. Is your life lived in such a dynamic way? If you're not living an attractive life because you're living an inconsistent life, if you're grumpy and you're complaining and you're the one that's always writing the comment card and bashing restaurants and bashing people around you, if you're the one going nuts in traffic, if you're the one that's throwing your arms up because someone took your buoy in the lake, like what, you know what I'm saying? Like if that's just your life, right? If you're an undisciplined person and you're no different than anybody else, then why would anybody say, "I want to know this Jesus that you know"? So Jesus prays and says, "Man, I just want your life to be different. I want people to see that the gospel is making a difference in you because your reputation matters." That's even part of what Paul was getting to in Romans chapter 12. Romans 12, verse 1 and 2, very familiar passage for a lot of you. He says this amazing, beautiful thing. He says, "I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." He's saying you, like as a group of people, your individual lives, present yourselves as a single sacrifice. You become something that the world looks at, a city on a hill. And then he concludes in verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Like he's saying, your community demonstrates something. You take your individual lives and you become something together that people see. And the gospel affects and it modifies and it revises and it changes everything about us. He's saying, you as a community, talk about this, think about this, wrestle with this, and see where the gospel makes us different people from the world around us. So do we as a community or as communities stand out from the world around us? Is our communal life transformed by the gospel? For example, in the world that we live in, sexuality is treated one particular way. Do we live towards sex the same way as our culture, or do we have a different perspective on it? Beauty in our culture is believed to be one thing. Do men inside this community of faith treat women as beautiful, but not because of what's on the exterior, but what's on the interior? Do we view power as something that's gained through position or wealth? Or do we view power as something that's given from God, from a future, a time that influences this present moment? Do we see things differently? Do we value things differently? See, when Jesus speaks about this, when Jesus is talking and praying, he's saying, I want you to model an alternative society. I want you to show people something different. I want you to show people that there's a different way to do business. There's a different way to climb the ladder. And there's a different way to move through education. There's a different way to approach sexuality. There's a different way to approach race relations. There's a different way to approach art and conflict resolution. There's a different way to understand your family. There's a different way for all of these things. Jesus says, I'm praying that you would show people that there's another way. Because when they see that, they'll be compelled to know. There's a British theologian named Leslie Newbigin, an incredible scholar, and I love so many of the things that he's written, but he says this, I love this. He says, the gospel does not become public truth for a society by being propagated as a theory or as a worldview, and certainly not as a religion. It can become public truth only insofar as it is embodied in a society, the church, which is both abiding in Christ and engaged in the life of the world. So if we really want to help people get a glimpse of the age to come, we need to be gospel-speaking, neighbor-loving, life-transformed communities. We need that. We need that here. We need it everywhere. We need it in every nook and cranny. And here's the bottom line. Here's the point. The gospel does not make us perfect people. That is not what we are pretending to be. The gospel doesn't make us holier than thou. The gospel transforms us. It changes us. And that transformation, that change is what changes everything. Amen. Would you guys stand with me? And can we pray together? Lord, I think you know as well as we do, this world needs a city on a hill. This world needs an alternative city, a new community of people, a different way of thinking and seeing the world. And Lord, for all of us in this room, myself included, these words are challenging. Challenging because there's people that we probably need to talk with about Jesus. There's people who know that we have a hope, but they don't know why. And we probably need to open our mouths and talk about you. It's challenging because there's transformation that needs to take place, and we're holding on to idols. We're holding on to stuff for value and purpose and meaning. And the longer we hold on to it, the more disintegration is around us, and we just need to let go, but it's hard. So God, I know this takes faith and trust on our part. I pray that you'd give it to us. Lord, we need your grace to change us, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of those that are watching. So help us be a community of faith that's a city on a hill and proclaims your goodness. We pray this in your name. Amen. May you be a city on a hill. May you live a grace-transformed life. And may those around you benefit as much as you do. Amen. Love you guys so much. See you guys next Sunday. Hang out, talk to some friends, and we'll see you guys next week.